Hello! I am back with another in-depth analysis on everybody's favorite gay pirate show. Today I want to talk about why Stede and Ed were never going to run away to China, and why that's important. Ed and Stede running away to China together, not only was that never a real option, them running away together and them entering a genuine relationship were mutually exclusive possibilities. If they wanted an actual relationship, they could not have that by running away together. And if they did run away together, as long as they did so, their relationship could never be real. It would have been something more in line with like a fantasy, a fling, a vacationship. The show really goes out of its way to hammer that point home too. Not only do we see Ed excitedly making plans for escaping as far away as possible from everything and person they've ever known, but that fantasies of a new life and new names and everything is intercut with Stede's flashbacks of Mary, who represents the real world that Stede ran away from and the harm he caused doing so, talking about how you should make the best out of the only life you get. And the dog gets out, so. Alright, and we're back. So, both men, Stede and Ed, became pirates because of the misery their realities in the past have caused them. They first met as a direct result of them both aspiring to live within myths, but the foundation of the friendship and romantic bond between them was a direct result of each of them stepping out of those myths and really showing each other who they were. A relationship that began by running away to a new fantasy life from the fantasy lives they'd run away to could never, ever be real. And Stede sees this. In fact, it's Ed's excitement over the idea that makes him see this. He knows he can't keep running further into his fantasies. At this point, he knows what he wishes could be real, but recognizes that no matter what, he first needs to acknowledge his own reality and the destruction he's caused. There is no way forward for him without first acknowledging the reality he left behind and the harm he caused in doing so. I think at this point, he doesn't see a future in which the relationship between he and Ed can be a real one, but what he does know is that he can't move ahead either in that romantic relationship or any aspect of his life without going back to face reality first. So Stede's field trip back begins with that assumption that he only has those two options. Something real that makes him miserable, or something he loves that will never be real. Throughout his time back, he begins to see that he actually can have the future he wants, and for it not just to be an escapist fantasy. So he begins atoning for the damage he's caused, and tying up all the loose ends to close that chapter of his life, so that he can actually move on to the one with his found family and the man he loves. So, instead of running into the fantasy, China, within the fantasy, the revenge, Stede returns to the real-world consequences of what he's done, which is his home with Mary. He knows facing reality is inevitable, and that this version of reality makes him miserable, and in that he's making other people miserable too. Instead of staying miserable forever, Stede puts in the emotional growth and labor required to turn the life that makes him really happy into reality. Now, Ed, on the other hand, does not see what Stede does. Not enough, at least, not at first. When it becomes clear to him that a new life in a new country with a new boyfriend and a new name isn't going to happen, he leaves the service and he goes back to the ship. He does try to deal with his depression and denial by letting himself be Ed. He really does. At first. He knows he probably should. The past month or so, as he and Stede bonded, is maybe the first time since becoming the Kraken as a child that he's really letting himself face reality and be Ed, and he's shocked to learn that he's actually really happy doing so because he's doing it with Stede. But now that Stede is gone, he's living in reality as Ed, and it's heartbreaking and miserable. The option is there to keep at it and to do, like we see Stede is doing during this separation, the emotional growth and labor required to turn the life that makes him happy into reality. The crew is ready to talk it through, but it's really emotionally difficult to do that. It's part of being a human. A real one, not just a myth. So it makes sense that he doesn't return to the real world consequences of what he's done, either in the literal sense, because he runs away to the ship instead of returning to the Royal Privateering Academy for Wayward Seamen. Because we know that even just acknowledging reality is something that the relationship allowed him to do. I mean, we've got lines of, it's not just this is who I am, it's this is who I am, Stede. You are always going to realize what I am. And I'm not a good person, Stede. This relationship is letting him acknowledge reality in a way he never has. And I mean, the series shows us time and time again that a retreat into a fantasy has been a constant for Ed since he was a child, especially when faced with situations with exceptional levels of emotional damage that require dealing with. And some examples, I won't go into too many details here because you've seen the show if you're watching this, but some examples of those can be symbolized by the red silk, the kraken, and the snail fork. So it makes sense, really, that instead of facing his reality and allowing those around him to help turn it into one he can be happy in, he retreats back into the fantasy, but this time tenfold. Obviously, the pressure from Izzy does not help, but the groundwork was already there. Yet another layer of how these journeys are mirrored but opposite is the transitional aspect. So, as I've alluded to here, and I have more breakdown on the detail of this in my other YouTube video, the one about the shove. I won't go into too much detail on this here, but basically Ed the man transforms into a literal manifestation of Blackbeard the myth. And this transition of shutting out reality and fully entering the myth is done through the destruction of virtually everything that reminds him of Stede, and thus of the real Ed. Stede's transition, meanwhile, shuts the door on his past reality so that his future doesn't have to be a fantasy, and it's done not only by faking his death, but doing that in the most absolutely absurd way possible. Which comes back to my original point. Stede realizes that he wants to have a real future with the man he's fallen in love with, and that to do this, he first needs to acknowledge reality and not just keep living in fantasy. And so he puts in the emotional work necessary to make that happen. And the transition that will make him happy is done through a hilarious fuckery. But in doing so, Stede accidentally triggers Ed into a mirrored but backwards series of events. Ed finds himself forced, at least, to at least sort of acknowledge reality, at least mentally. I mean, he doesn't, like I said, doesn't return to the academy, but he does the songwriting and makes the plans for the talent show, and has everybody calling him Ed and stuff. But he ultimately gives up on the emotional work necessary to make that happen. And true, yes, at this point, like Stede, he has realized the fantasy is not going to make him happy. But there's also a lot less emotional work involved in shutting down and going numb instead of trying to grow. And so Ed runs fully back into his Blackbeard persona, and it's done through, transition that's very depressing, permanent, and a bleak destruction of all things real. A mirrored but opposite version of the piano being hoisted halfway in the kitten. But so for there to now be any future between the two of them, it's not enough to reunite. It's not even enough to discuss and forgive each other. Stede's intentions and existence are now rooted in reality instead of fantasy. But Ed has doubled down and gone full myth, full Blackbeard. Then two major themes of this show are self-acceptance, not necessarily as one would assume in terms of sexuality, but just in terms of the self, and the acceptance of reality versus fantasy. So, as I've tried to explain here, Season 1 was the story of Stede's journey towards these two different types of acceptance, and when it happens, I honestly believe Season 2 has to be Ed's.